Hello, welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on all things impacting transatlantic relations. My name is Jörn Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and my guest today is Zach Meyers, Senior Research Fellow with the Center for European Reform, who works on all things EU competition, regulatory, and digital policy, an expert in regulatory policy and networked industries, and someone who has advised the private sector and governments around the world. So a warm welcome, Zach.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's dive right in. Competition, trade, industrial, and chips policy have been all the rage lately, taking on an increasingly geopolitical angle. We've had the recent transatlantic dispute that most of our viewers will be familiar with over the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act on the US side for the competitiveness of European industry, especially. We had in response President von der Leyen's announcement at Davos of the EU's Net Zero Industry Act. Friendshoring has been, at the top of economic policy chatter for a while now. Where do we go from here? How would you assess this broader trend of more activist industrial strategies, industrial policy on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. I think all economists and commentators would say that there has, if not been deglobalization, at least a trend towards kind of less intensive globalization than we've seen in the past couple of decades. And I think it's really an open question as to how far that's going to go and whether we will end up seeing globalization in reverse or not. What I think we have seen is that the slowing globalization is really being focused on a couple of key strategic sectors. And it's absolutely in the West's interests for it to stay that way. And I guess we're going to see whether countries like China are prepared for that slowing to stay within a couple of designated lanes, or whether it will turn out into kind of more open economic warfare. And just being driven by a couple of different trends. And I think one of them is definitely the increasing use of sanctions, increasing use of extraterritorial regulation. And what I think has been really fascinating is that, this was definitely not the first transatlantic rift. We've been seeing quite a few of them over the past couple of years. And I don't think it's going to be the last either. So, however you see it, we're definitely entering a world of greater geopolitical tension, and that's definitely got economic implications. The focus isn't on efficiency anymore. It's on kind of resilience and security.
Thank you, Zach. And so just to follow up on that a little bit, maybe turning to the EU more specifically, as I said, we had that announcement of the EU Net Zero Industry Act as a response in many ways to the IRA, to the Inflation Reduction Act on the US side. How do you think Europe is making the most of that trend? And you talked about specific sectors. Maybe you can dive a little bit into that, into more details. And most importantly, do you think there is a way? We've heard the first complaints on the European side that this an approach at the European level will mainly benefit the big players, Germany, but maybe also France, and what this means for the single market, where there's concerns over fragmentation as a result of this new policy focus.
Yeah, well, maybe if I can take a step back before we look at which interests in the EU benefit or lose from this. But I think overall, the EU has quite a lot to lose from globalization, if you can call it that. And it certainly has a different approach to the US on this issue, largely for kind of economic reasons. So Europe is a much more trade-intensive economy than the US is. And in particular, there are certain EU countries that have quite strong trade and investment links with China. And so the risks associated with even a partial decoupling are a lot more significant for parts of Europe than they are for the US. And also, I think there's kind of a broader strategic and even philosophical difference in tackling the strategic threat posed by China. Germany, for example, has long had this idea of change through trade, or Wandel durch Handel, and this idea that strong trade links are going to lead to more democratization and better accommodation of trading partners' different interests. And we've seen that hasn't worked out very well in Russia. Germany in particular had a huge reliance on Russian fossil fuel trade, and that has absolutely not led to a converging of kind of broader geopolitical interests, as we've seen. But I think there's still a desire in parts of the EU to hold on to that ideal. And then I think there's also worries about whether decoupling really can be limited to the particular sectors where it makes sense for the West. China still has a huge grip on the market for kind of rare earths and other types of important inputs into semiconductors and green technology. And so I think a lot of stakeholders in Europe are asking, is this really the right time for us to decouple and to risk China retaliating and kind of removing a lot of the inputs, where Europe and the US have kind of a medium to long-term plan to adjust and to remove Chinese dependencies in those areas. But that's definitely something where China could make the West hurt in the short term. So I think that Europe definitely has a different approach to China, but Europe also has kind of a tense relationship with the US as well. And I alluded to this before. I think on the one hand, there's a worry that even though we have President Biden, who's obviously somewhat more accommodating of European interests, although that still hasn't avoided the Inflation Reduction Act spat, there's still a risk that you could get a much more isolationist administration in the future, someone more along the lines of Trump. And so, do we really want to cut off our dependencies with China and become more dependent on the US instead? Maybe that's not a wise bet. And then, as I alluded to before, I think extraterritoriality and sanctions is something that Europe's really worried about. And obviously, Europe is not going to be the subject of those sanctions. But there's definitely been areas in the past where Europe has felt compelled to follow the US, when it comes to Iran, or the way that certain payment systems have been compelled by the US government to act or to not do business with certain players, where Europe might have taken a different approach. And because of dependency on kind of US businesses, Europe has felt that it hasn't been able to do that. So I think that is also a factor that's leading Europe to fear kind of falling too wholeheartedly into the US camp, even though obviously both players recognize the tension that Chinese growth is creating, and the values problems that creates for the world.
And how do you see the internal dynamics? I mentioned sort of the concerns about fragmentation of the internal market, the disparities. Not all member states' economies are born equal, right? So what do you see as key dynamics there?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because in the last couple of weeks, we've seen these radically different proposals on how to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act from different stakeholders, including some really key politicians and leaders in the EU. We've got people like Commissioner Vestager, Dombrovskis and Timmermans, who are all very focused on not fighting fire with fire and keeping the response quite proportionate and limited. And then others like Thierry Breton, who is very focused on unleashing as much subsidy as possible. And to some extent, you can just kind of look at where those stakeholders have come from to see where different countries' interests lie. I mean, state aid has hugely benefited the big member states who have a lot more fiscal capacity, like France and Germany. During the pandemic, the loosening of state aid led to France and Germany spending, I think, nearly 80% of the total EU member states' state aid, which is kind of really quite extraordinary. And so, there's definitely a fear that you're going to fragment the single market. You're going to lead to quite an unlevel playing field if countries are kind of allowed to depart too far from kind of the state aid restrictions that in general have served Europe pretty well. So certainly in my view, I think we should be playing more towards kind of the EU's long-term competitiveness and less on trying to compete the US headlong with a couple of short-term sugar hits. And there's definitely projects that are fairly indisputably going to help European industry. Things like increasing the capital markets cohesion, so that kind of rather than protecting the existing businesses that exist in the EU and are obviously very worried about the Inflation Reduction Act, that you're going to have capital that's being able to be put into kind of startups and scale-ups that are going to find new ways to make Europe competitive in the future.
Some of which have been under discussion for a long time.
Yeah.
The question whether there's the political will to steer this energy into those efforts is my initial response. But I do want to come to sort of your work on semiconductors. You've written a lot about the CHIPS Acts on both sides of the Atlantic. And you've been critical of what you've called sort of chip nationalism, especially on the EU and even the UK side that you've written about. Can you explain to us and to our viewers a little bit what you think are the biggest sort of misconceptions, challenges, mistakes that the EU and maybe the UK are at risk of making here?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to really start from a big picture view of what the chip supply chain looks like, which is that it is incredibly complicated. It involves absolutely thousands of different inputs. Like when you look at the Dutch firm ASML, which doesn't even produce chips, it produces the lithography machines, which are the machines that can print circuits onto wafers. So that by itself is just kind of one input into chip manufacturing, and their supply chain is absolutely extraordinary. So of course they are very sophisticated engineers, really at the absolute cutting edge of what's possible today. But more than that, the supply chain logistics involved in kind of managing that business are quite incredible. And certainly when the Ukraine war started and sanctions on Russia were being proposed, no one was really thinking that there were imports like gases and minerals coming from Ukraine and Russia, in some cases only coming from Ukraine and Russia, that would affect how ASML and how chip making companies were able to do business. So it's incredibly complicated. And I think that you have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about, well, what does increasing our autonomy mean? Because it is just not realistic for any country to think that they can onshore the entire supply chain for semiconductor manufacturing. It's just not possible. We've seen China spend hundreds of billions of dollars in the last 10 years or so on a strategy to achieve that, and it has completely failed. I believe that they produce about 10 to 15% of their own chips, which is far below what their ambitions were. And so the idea that spending a lot less than that, the EU or the US is going to be able to do the same thing is kind of a fantasy. So then I think the question is, well, the focus is on chip manufacturing, this one point in the supply chain. And I kind of question how much autonomy you actually get by moving one point of that supply chain onshore and leaving everything else out. And so, maybe we just have to accept that autarky is not something that is possible for anyone. And we have to think a little bit more strategically about how we maybe not achieve autonomy, but at least kind of increase our autonomy. And so I think, that leads to a couple of different questions. One is, where are the areas where we really are dependent on players, global players that, we have values conflicts with, and, possibly more than values, but, potential military conflicts or economic conflicts with in the future. And, certainly when you look at China, it's going to be rare earths that are going to be a particular problem. And so I think that the work that the EU is doing on diversifying trade in rare earths, getting it more from countries like Australia, and the recycling program so that we don't have to buy or mine as much in the first place is quite a good initiative, and probably far better than focusing on the headlines of we want to produce 20% of the world's cutting edge chips. I think secondly, we should focus on what are the particular strengths and comparative advantages that Europe has over other countries. And I've already spoken about ASML, but this lithography business is one where Europe really has carved out a niche and is far ahead of any other player around the world. And so I think the question's got to be, well, how do we firstly kind of cement that so that others aren't going to come in and replicate it? And how can we expand it to kind of neighboring markets? And then I think thirdly, when we want to think about how is Europe going to increase its market share in important points of that value chain in the future, we have to be kind of realistic about what is already there, and that we're not going to win a race where we're already far behind. And that means focusing on medium to longer term technologies rather than focusing on what is in the headlines and what is cutting edge today. You can kind of leapfrog ahead on some technologies, and that means probably not putting all your eggs in one basket. It means kind of taking a portfolio approach to industrial strategy, where you accept you're going to put money into the losers that don't work out, but that gives you a better chance of having at least some winners. And in my view, at least, it's better than throwing money into a race where you're never going to come first.
Thank you, Zach. Well, that looking ahead brings me to my last question, unfortunately, already. Asking you to play a little bit of Oracle and look ahead for us. What do you think in this whole industrial policy debate? What is sort of one trend, one development that people are underestimating that policymakers and us as watchers should be paying a lot more attention to?
You warned me about this question at the start, and I've been trying to think of an answer all the way through. This is obviously not something that has been missed in the debate, but I think it's important because a lot of us, including me, are often quite skeptical of industrial strategy and in kind of a more proactive industrial policy. But I think that the work that Europe has done on kind of green energy is absolutely critical and a complete no-brainer. To me, it is focused on removing dependencies from countries that have a kind of values conflicts with Europe, and it's going to hugely help European competitiveness because a lot of the businesses that are suffering right now are suffering from the high energy costs that have been the result of Europe having to very quickly withdraw from importing Russian fossil fuels and having to find replacements, for example, through LNG that are a lot more expensive and where they're going to be competing with Asia on world markets. And so I don't think the EU can get enough praise for how quickly it's been able to move and for having thought about this before, even though it wasn't as much of a priority as it should have been. If you can allow me one more point, I think that there is a lot of work being done on what I've talked before about kind of future technologies where Europe could still get ahead. And I think that is an area where the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the US really has some potential to bring the EU and the US closer together on kind of developing standards, on joint research projects, and on kind of making sure that the West isn't left kind of trailing behind China on AI or quantum computing and similar types of areas. And I think, the fact that there's this dialogue happening is, can only be good news.
Well, thank you, Zach. We're out of time. You pointed to the TTC, Trade and Technology Council between the United States and European Union, something that we at the Europe Center have been following closely through our digital work, something that I hope we can bring you back into the conversation on. I know it's something you follow closely. So thank you so much, Zach Meyers of the Center for European Reform, for joining us for this conversation on sort of the industrial policy picture transatlantically, globally. Thank you for your insights, and thank you to our viewers for watching today. And keep your eyes open for more content on the Europe Center's Atlantic Debrief. Thank you, and see you soon.